So the apologies I've received so far, these aren't in alphabetical order, I'm afraid. Councillor Doolan, Councillor O'Rourke, Councillor Graham, Councillor Stevenson, Councillor Carson, Councillor Duffy, Councillor Redding, Councillor McVeigh, Councillor Michael Coyle, Councillor McNeill and Councillor Curry.
Does anybody know any other apologies that haven't been read out? Councillor Docherty, can you mute, please?
Okay.
Thank you. So last night we finished at agenda item 17, which is a notice of motion. Colleagues, a composite motion has now been agreed, is detailed on the amended list to you. Councillor Burrows is going to move it and Councillor Linden seconded it. There is no amendment indicated to this motion. Do you still wish to speak, Councillor Burrows?
Provost, I would still like to speak.
Well, if you want to go ahead, thank you.
Provost, I wanted to speak on it because I believe it's an important topic. I think the comments within the motion are self-explanatory. Like the previous motion on staff, we unanimously acknowledged the help and dedication from our staff and unions during the COVID crisis. On behalf of the Council, I want to say the same for our community partners, but crucially, those in the charitable, community and voluntary sector across all of North Lanarkshire. I know all the councillors appreciate the work of staff, and I equally know the incredible and positive work within all the voluntary and third sector organisations. And I thank you all for your commitment, your dedication and help. The importance of that work is shown when political groups come together, like today, in a composite motion which reflects the significance of their work. I have said on numerous occasions that our community partners are important to us, as we could not provide the many special dedicated services delivered by that sector. In other words, we rely on them for many essential services. I need to say I can speak on this personally. Before I became a councillor, I spent many years as a volunteer in a local group, delivering vital services to the residents, believe it or not, of North Lanarkshire. I also left a good council job, and again, that was in North Lanarkshire, to go and work in a national charity for over 5 years, which provided a vital services to many people, not only in North Lanarkshire, but throughout Scotland. So I personally fully appreciate the hard work delivered by all our community partners. During this COVID period, it's also good to note the joint work between the various groups and the link with the council where it's appropriate. Many individuals and volunteers came forward during this COVID time to give what they can and support others, which is vital. And can I say thank you again to every one of them. The mover of the motion, I don't want to single out any one particular group or a range of groups. There's no doubt if someone is missed out, that might be deemed a bit unfair. However, I suspect some councillors may want to highlight some of that positive work going on within their own ward to show we all appreciate the excellent service to our community. Can I finally say, on behalf of every councillor within North Lanarkshire Council, thanks to the wide range of community partners, especially those in the charitable, community and voluntary sector during this COVID crisis. I move the motion, Provost.
Thank you very much. Councillor Linden.
Thanks, Provost. I welcome the opportunity to second the composite motion between our groups today, the opportunity to unite in expressing our gratitude and thanks for the outstanding contribution and the valiant efforts made by a wide range of community partners, but crucially the charitable and voluntary sector, as Councillor Burrows has said, across North Lanarkshire during the COVID pandemic is one that I personally relish. Provost, the pandemic is an event which will shape our history and for many years to come, and despite the obvious heartbreak and significant challenges that it caused, it did do one clear thing in my view, a silver lining if ever there was one, which was bringing all of our communities together, bringing all of our services together and seeing barriers being dropped with a focus being on getting help to those who needed it most. Indeed, I was in a meeting just the other day with the Chief Executive and we all reflected on the amazing work that had been done in such a short space of time to mobilise our efforts to deal with the worst impacts of coronavirus. And whilst the remainder of my contribution this morning will wish to focus on the community and voluntary sector's response, I do wish to formally record my thanks to all the staff of North Lanarkshire Council and NHS Lanarkshire, particularly as a member of the Integration Joint Board for Health and Social Care. Indeed, that goes also to the wide range of other public services who stepped up to the challenge, united in their overarching ambition to deliver for our communities at this most difficult time. Of course, I know firsthand the role that was played by the community and voluntary sector, having been privileged to play a part in that COVID response in my own community. And it's on that experience that I want to share my remarks and shape my remarks this morning. Because in Bellshill, Thornleywood and Moss End and Hollytown alone, the response of the public in wishing to volunteer their time, resources and efforts to make a positive difference to the lives of those around them was overwhelming. From my own perspective, just as seeing the involvement as chair of Communities Together, that saw in the space of 6 weeks almost 1,000 people receiving urgent food parcel support, prescription deliveries and personal shopping. All of that conducted by a team of 70 volunteers. Our volunteers continue to work 5 days a week to get all manner of supports to local people, and I know from hearing from them just how much of a lifeline support they've been. We did this working in partnership with Financial Inclusion and indeed Gordon Thompson and his team at Lanarkshire Community Food and Health Partnership. The holistic support provided also includes follow-up calls for everyone to ensure that they get long-term support. Provost, the example of Communities Together is just one of the many groups working across North Lanarkshire. Indeed, I reflected recently on Maddie Halliday, the Chief Executive of Voluntary Action North Lanarkshire, in one of her briefings, in which she outlined that there were some 15 or more new volunteer-led COVID groups established, providing community support and emergency food to local people. All of that has been supported by Vanel, and I understand that they've been working with over 80 community and voluntary groups, as well as the council and NHS staff, to jointly plan and support the amazing community response. That approach meant that our communities were able to be supported to rapidly respond to an ever-changing environment with COVID and ensure a holistic and connected approach with the efforts of the council, the NHS and other statutory partners. Together, we were able to place aside working barriers and, frankly, red tape to come together to offer support to the most vulnerable during one of the most challenging periods in all of our lifetimes. And I take the opportunity today to reiterate my sincere thanks and the sincere thanks of my group to the significant community and voluntary sector efforts, the efforts of Voluntary Action North Lanarkshire, all of the groups that have been involved, and significantly, most significantly, the thanks of all of us here to the people of North Lanarkshire for their volunteering contribution that kept our communities supplied with food, defending and crucial support. So from all of us, thank you for the work that you did for our communities during the COVID pandemic. Thank you, Provost.
Thank you very much. Sir Lennon, you've indicated you want in, but when it's an unopposed motion, we have no speakers on it other than the mover and the seconder. So we will move on to agenda item 18, which is a notice of motion from Councillor Hogg, seconded by Councillor Goldsack. Councillor Hogg, there is no amendment indicated to your motion. Do you wish to speak?
Good morning, Provost. Yes, I would like to make some comments. I'll make them brief.
If you want to continue with them then.
Okay. Last year, we effectively agreed a motion for the banning of the use of glyphosate throughout the North Lanarkshire estate. And it's only recently that the environmental impact assessment has been started. We don't have the feedback from that yet. But can I just remind colleagues that glyphosate itself is basically a relative of one of the most toxic poisons that was used during a war many years ago. It comes from Monsanto, and there's been over 3,000 lawsuits in America over the last few years. There's been millions of dollars paid out, and it's known to adversely affect, well, it's used very extensively in all forms of agriculture. And the reality is that it is basically soaked into the food chain. And I know that our contribution is pretty small, but the end up effect is that what you might call the soil microbiome across the planet and topsoil, the nutrients have been effectively destroyed And that then ends up going into the food chain in parts per million. And it has also affected what you would call, in the sort of human situation, our microbiome, which contains about 80% of our immune system. And the net effect is that glyphosate is known scientifically, and you'll find this in peer-reviewed papers, to contribute to chronic illness. Now, given that it is created and produced by a massive corporate powerful group, what we tend to have, or has happened, is that they buy their own scientists. But the basic nuts and bolts for us here in North Lanarkshire is that we've been spraying it in play parks and areas where kids play, around schools, and walking areas where people take their dogs, etc. So the practicality is that the science and reality, the damage it does, has been suppressed. There's a few councils in England that have stopped it. I think it's going to be phased out by the European Union over the next few years. And I think Monsanto know, really what's coming with them. It just is one of these things that they've been allowed to keep using for so long. And I look forward to reading the report of alternative ways of dealing with weeds. I think over the next few weeks we can have our groundsmen and staff who are professional, and I trust them to find alternative ways of using it. So can I point out that one of the most recent peer-reviewed papers I looked at, because I always look at the science for any judgments I make on anything, and that glyphosate basically works through what's called the shikimate pathway. We know that exists in plants, but the recent peer-reviewed papers are showing that the shikimate pathway also exists within the human microbiome. So it's actually destroying the human microbiome in parts per million. And also as well, in 2017, over 1 million people signed a petition in Europe for it to be banned. So this is not some sort of wacky thing. The science is rock solid. And I think it's time that we moved away from the use of this. And I think we can find more practical and simple and safer ways of dealing with weeds in our parks. Thank you, Provost. I move the motion.
Councillor Goldsack.
Thank you, Provost. Councillor Hogg has explained everything well, and I'd like to second the motion.
Thank you very much. We will move on to agenda item 19, which is a notice of motion from Councillor Hogg and seconded by Councillor Beveridge. There's no amendment indicated to your motion, Councillor Hogg. Do you still wish to speak? Councillor Hogg.
Thanks, Provost. Yeah, I'll keep this brief as well. It's a bit slow in pressing the button there and clearing it. So I think this, given some of the stuff that has occurred with the pandemic, I think this is an essential move to make because we don't know what's coming next. I recently turned my garden over and put some fruit and veg and stuff in there. And it's my concerns that over the next 6 months or a year, there might be possible disruptions to just the logistics of getting food supply up and down the UK and from Europe, given some of the constraints with the pandemic. So I thought the more that people in North Lanarkshire and across Scotland can use and utilise bits of land here and there. We're already doing this. The council's done a fantastic job. I've got to credit staff with the food growing strategy. And I think there's even been stuff put up in the last few months as well. So this is not something that's new to North Lanarkshire. We've been fantastic in doing what we've done so far. And there's a few areas and places that have done, created great allotments, the village for one, and I've visited a few other ones in the area recently just to check them out. And there's lots of expertise. So I think this is something where community partnerships can kick in so we can get some best practice. Locally, there's Watch Us Grow at Palace Rig, and we can bring in schools. And I think I'd hope that we might be able to prioritise or at least load any areas where we can develop more and more allotments towards families with young kids where they're in flats where they don't have access to growing stuff. Because I remember my kids' excitement when they were small of just growing peas, etc. Just simple little things that are just wonderful. The kids get excited about it. So I think it's something that we can do. And it's basically there under the Community Empowerment Scotland Act 2015. And council are doing a great job. And basically, I'm hoping we can develop as many allotments as we can possibly push for in every town and village, and possibly even see if farmers or whatever might even give us some assistance. So I think this is something that could become far more important than some people realise in the next 6 months or year, if there are any more serious issues happening with our economy and our ability to survive and pull together as a community. I so move the motion. Thank you, Provost.
Councillor Beveridge.
Thanks, Provost. Just to confirm, is it 5 minutes I've got to speak for?
Maximum.
That's fine. Don't worry, I'll not be there for 5 minutes. No, Paddy, this is a fantastic motion. As Paddy says, the North Lanarkshire Council have been doing great work in encouraging encouraging allotments. This local food resilience campaign, it can't help it. So you stop that. Also, I'd definitely recommend what Paddy was saying. I've put a few pounds on during this lockdown campaign, and turning over the garden is a fantastic way of getting rid of them. So I've got great pleasure in making this motion. Thanks, Provost.
Thank you very much. We'll now move on to agenda item 20. It's a notice of motion from Councillor Johnston, seconded by Councillor Linden. Councillor Johnston.
Morning, Provost. Right, it's straightforward enough, this motion. North Lanarkshire Council agrees to write to the UK Chancellor. Now, the UK Chancellor has, of course, already refused this to the devolved administrations, but that doesn't mean that you can't write again, because there's an ongoing international emergency. So I think the pressure has still got to be kept up on the UK Chancellor in this matter. And remember what it's asking for. It's asking for temporary powers to raise loans and to have the ability to switch capital funding to revenue funding to deal with the coronavirus crisis. So that's the background to it. It's to deal with this crisis. And remember, the principle of devolution from a UK point of view, that the local areas know best what to do in their local areas. So the Scottish devolved administration and the Welsh one and the Northern Irish one know what's best for their particular needs. And there are obviously changing COVID needs in all areas of the UK at different times, as we're constantly seeing. So this is still very much a vibrant necessity. And I would also point out that if you look at the financial, our own financial officer's revised financial forecast, dotted throughout it is a need for a need of how to deal with uncertainty. For instance, at 2.2.7, it tells us that officers are aware that the Scottish Government is considering other potential solutions which may help further mitigate the costs of COVID-19, including opportunities for fiscal flexibilities which would allow us to borrow for revenue purposes and a compensation for loss of income scheme. So we also find other references much in the same vein. If we go to 2.2.2, further down there, a contingency sum of 5 million is deemed prudent to allow for costs in relation to COVID-19, which are still to be quantified and have yet to be identified. So it's again pointing out we're in a totally unknown situation, and this is why we need the flexibility of the Scottish Government being able to quickly raise these loans. And of course, this is to help local authorities. Everybody knows that COP has been in constant touch with the Scottish Government looking for cash support. This is going to be ongoing for a long time, and there are immediate needs come out, and the Scottish Government can't be waiting and and the go-ahead from London for these things. Neither can our local authorities. We just simply don't know what's going to turn up. And if we go to 2.2.1, again, we see the finance officer. The financial position is, however, complex and subject to ongoing change linked to evolving government guidance and availability of funding. Financial implications will continue to be refined as time scales, duration and recovery requirement clearer. So we're in a totally fluid situation with all sorts of emergencies jumping up at us all the time. We've seen the lockdown in Aberdeen, crisis in Gretna and so on. So I think it's fairly obvious that we should be supporting this request for temporary power to raise loans, as the motion says, to make it easier for local government to get cash quickly off Edinburgh to deal with emerging situations. Thank you.
Councillor Linden.
Thank you, Provost. I welcome the opportunity to second the motion by the SNP group today on the call for the extension of borrowing powers to the devolved administrations across this United Kingdom. In July, ahead of the Chancellor of the Exchequer's summer statement, the Finance Secretaries of the three devolved administrations asked for capital spending to be moved over to day-to-day revenue and for an end to arbitrary limits on borrowing. I echo the view of the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Kate Forbes, in that the relatively limited powers which we are asking for would help ease some of the immense pressure on our budget at Scottish Government level and, by extension, the pressures on local government, giving us more tools to kickstart our recovery. The powers that we and other devolved governments seek are reasonable, straightforward and would not cost the UK Government a penny. The Cabinet Secretary for Finance herself has articulated the need for these powers, as at present she cannot take money from the capital budget, which the Government have been unable to spend because of COVID-19, and use it for revenue. Yet it is revenue that pays for a record investment in our National Health Service, significant investment in the attainment gap, and the support we offer to business, as well as keeping our transport systems running, to name but a few. Like other countries across the world, we cannot respond quickly to emerging needs by borrowing, leaving us overly dependent on policy decisions made by the UK Government, a position which, frankly, no government in these islands would want, given the UK Government's record. As we emerge from the greatest economic shock of our lifetime, it's essential that fiscal rules do not constrain the fiscal policy response, and thereby weakening the economic recovery and doing more harm to the long-term fiscal position. Indeed, underpinning our approach is a belief that economic stimulus and tackling inequality must be prioritised over deficit reduction until the recovery has taken hold. A focus on austerity and deficit reduction over tackling inequality and restoring our economy would be a grave error by the UK Government. Provost, to conclude, our motion today, articulated by Councillor Johnson and by extension the Cabinet Secretary, outlines exactly why we need these powers. We require these powers now to make the decisions needed to grow our economy and create jobs nationwide, but crucially in allowing the Scottish Government the capacity to greater support local government. I believe that alongside the Scottish, Welsh and Northern Ireland governments, we in local government across Scotland, but in particular North Lanarkshire, should join the calls in making this urgent case to the Treasury to ensure we have a sustainable and strong economic recovery against the backdrop of coronavirus. Thank you, Provost.
Thank you. There's an amendment from Councillor Wilson. Councillor Wilson.
Yep. Thank you, Provost. Now, I start from a position of not dismissing the motion from the SNP out of hand, and the Prime Minister did commit to give it consideration and did so for the temporary financial powers to be devolved to Holyrood. However, I am yet to be persuaded by the overall merits of the request, and I don't think a strong enough case has yet been made by the SNP for why the powers they are looking for are absolutely necessary. It's yesterday, the emergency financial support provided by the UK Government to Scotland during the coronavirus national emergency has been unprecedented. The Prime Minister has made it absolutely clear that the Treasury will continue to massively invest in Scotland. I made the point when speaking to a previous motion during yesterday's proceedings And the £6.5 billion Barnett funding from the UK government to Scotland has also included my amendment. During this particular debate, I think it's important to reinforce the point that this £6.5 billion figure refers solely to Barnett consequentials. It does not include furlough, self-employed support, the increased universal credit payments, bounce back loans, cuts in VAT, the Kickstart scheme, and other initiatives introduced. Support measures add up to a quite astonishing total of £15.7 billion. It is unprecedented state intervention on a scale never before witnessed in the history of the British state. Scotland has been fully supported at this time of crisis, and the UK government will continue to provide all of the finances required to all parts of the UK. Given this backdrop, I am sceptical about what transferring the requested powers can add to Scotland's coronavirus response. On top of this, the same mover and seconder of the SNP motion provided a number of examples of specific Scottish Government support initiatives put in place over the last couple of months during a previous debate. Therefore, and knowing other, the SNP leadership team have acknowledged that the Scottish Parliament has the authority just now to introduce supplementary financial aid packages to help tackle the issues emerging from the coronavirus. For that weakens the case being made that they need further powers to appropriately respond to the challenges presented by COVID. Additionally, it's important that Scottish stripping all that difficult. Additionally, this national emergency, the Finance Secretary delayed a period of intended for Scottish UK government. Hand over that money trust councils and pass on this funding right away typifies their general attitude to local authorities during their time in office at Holyrood. I'll bring my remarks to a close there, Provost.
Thank you. Councillor Callum.
Thank you, Provost Staff.
Is that you? Mark, have we got any speakers?
Provost, there's one speaker indicated that he wishes to come in, Councillor Burrows.
Councillor Burrows.
Provost, I just want to say that I highlighted yesterday in another debate on finance the need for both governments, and that's important to help councils during this COVID period. I need to say that our Labour group will keep highlighting the shortfall coming from the devolved structure, i.e. from Edinburgh to finance to local government. That's what's in the amendment, highlighting that. But I think the motion is right, and I'll tell you why the motion is right. The motion is right because it talks about allowing temporary powers. I'm just looking at it. It's about switching capital to revenue. And that won't be an easy thing to do if it comes off, and there will be consequences for that. But it also hopefully will give, as it says in the motion, a greater cash flow certainty for Scottish local authorities. I need to say, just on Councillor Wilson, you were saying there about at this time the powers are not necessary. I need to say, I understand where you're coming from as well, Councillor Wilson, I get it. But at this time, we need to try and get as much powers as we can up here to help deliver the issues that are happening in our community at the moment, where we're facing as a council that £18 million shortfall. So I'm just saying that the motion is correct, and we should go forward on that basis. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mark, any more speakers?
Provost, there's no further speakers.
Councillor Wilson to sum up.
Provost, happy not to say anything. Proceed.
Thank you, Councillor Johnston to sum up.
Thank you, Provost. Just to say that as regards to the Conservative amendment, the thrust of the Conservative amendment is essentially you've had quite enough money, thank you, and is actually against the motion in its spirit. So I think the Conservative amendment totally takes away from the motion, although it doesn't actually spell out that it's against the motion, but the whole implication of it is. The other points I would make is it's not just the Scottish Government that's asking for this, it's the Welsh Government and the Northern Irish Government that are also asking for it. We also accept that the Chancellor in the UK, and it's only the UK Government which can raise the cash, is in record as saying he will spend whatever it takes in order to combat the COVID crisis, and whatever it takes presumably means allowing the Scottish Government temporary powers to borrow to raise cash in this crisis. As regards the Conservative amendment and all the amazing sums we're getting from a United Kingdom government, again, it gives the impression that somehow we're getting a handout which we otherwise couldn't manage ourselves. But the financial figures show that what's happening is we're simply getting money back that we pay in anyway. And there's a direct comparison is with the Republic of Ireland, where they're spending 7.3 billion euros on their recovery package, most of which, the vast bulk of which is self-financed, and they actually pay into Europe. That they're not taking out of Europe. So, and Norway roundabout, we've been over these issues yesterday, the European funding. So these big sums that they throw at us are getting thrown at countries throughout the world and in Europe anyway. So the motion stands. I just simply move the motion without the amendment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Andrew, can we go over to the vote, please?
Yes, Provost. We have a motion by Councillor Tom Johnson and an amendment by Councillor Wilson. I'll call your name out in turn if you can indicate your vote. Councillor Anderson. Motion. Councillor Dinesh Ashraf.
Motion.
Councillor Junaid Ashraf.
Motion.
Councillor Baird.
Motion.
Councillor Barclay.
Motion.
Councillor Beveridge.
Motion.
Councillor Brannan McVeigh.
Motion.
Councillor Burgess.
Amendment.
Councillor Burrows.
Motion.
Councillor Cameron.
Amendment.
Councillor Campbell.
Motion.
Councillor Carragher.
Motion.
Councillor Castles.
Motion.
Councillor Sophia Coyle.
Motion.
Councillor Cullen.
Amendment.
Councillor Curran.
Motion.
Councillor Damasio.
Motion.
Councillor Doherty.
Motion.
Councillor Douglas.
Amendment.
Councillor Farouk.
Motion.
Councillor Fisher.
Motion.
Councillor Fotheringham.
Motion.
Councillor Gallagher.
Amendment.
Councillor Goldie.
Motion.
Thank you. Councillor Goldsack.
Amendment.
Councillor Gurley.
Motion.
Councillor Hogg.
Up.
Councillor Hogg. Appears to have dropped off the call. Councillor Hume.
Motion.
Councillor Catherine Johnson.
Motion.
Councillor Tom Johnson. Councillor Jones.
Motion.
Councillor Kelly.
Motion.
Councillor Kerr.
Motion.
Councillor Larson.
Motion.
Councillor Lennon.
Motion.
Councillor Linden.
Motion.
Councillor Lowe.
Motion.
Councillor McGowan.
Motion.
Councillor McCulloch.
Motion.
Councillor McLaren.
Motion.
Councillor McManus.
Motion.
Councillor McNally.
Motion.
Councillor McPick.
Motion.
Councillor Mooney.
Motion.
Councillor Pettigrew.
Motion.
Councillor Quigley.
Motion.
Councillor Rorty.
Motion.
Councillor Shevlin.
Motion.
Councillor Shields.
Motion.
Councillor Stephen.
Motion.
Councillor Stocks.
Motion.
Councillor Stubbs.
Motion.
Councillor Alan Valentine.
Motion.
Councillor Annette Valentine.
Motion.
Councillor Watson.
Amendment.
Councillor Weir. Councillor Weir.
Motion.
Thank you. Councillor Wilson.
Amendment.
Thank you. And Councillor Woods.
Motion.
Thank you. So the amendment has received 8 votes, the motion 49 votes, and no abstentions. So the motion
Excuse
is
me,
carried.
Andrew, sorry, you missed me out.
Oh, apologies. So if you could give me your vote then, please, Councillor Marston.
Yeah, motion.
Motion. So the amendment received 8 votes and the motion 50. So the motion is carried.
Thank you very much. We now move to agenda item 21, which is a notice of motion from Councillor Kelly, seconded by Councillor Junaid Ashraf. There is no amendment indicated to your motion. Do you wish to speak, Councillor Kelly?
Provost, thank you. I've just got a few remarks to make. I'll start by thanking Councillor Junaid Ashraf for working together with me on this motion, and also to the Conservative Group of Independents for your support. The action of eliminating racial injustice and discrimination in our society is an issue which I think transcends political differences, and I'm committed that the working group will operate in this way. Provost, as you know, we have a great slogan for North Lanarkshire. It's a place to live, learn, work, invest and visit. However, for many of our residents, they continue to suffer racism and racial inequality on a daily basis. To make North Lanarkshire the place we all aspire for it to be, we must act to eliminate racism in all forms. We all watched in shock and discussed the horrific death of George Floyd in the United States, which resulted in protests worldwide. And it's disappointing as a society that such incidents are required to bring into sharp focus the racial tensions in the world. Although there has been significant efforts to end discrimination in the UK, Scotland and North Lanarkshire, I think we must be honest, they've often been inadequate. It should not take incidents like the death of George Floyd to make the world take notice of racial injustice and discrimination. This should be the focus of all governments at all times until we live in a world of true equality and free of racism. For our part in North Lanarkshire, I'm pleased that rather than just state that we support the objectives of the Black Lives Matter movement, we're going further and taking a very significant step from the Council to take action to tackle all forms of racism. Critical to this is that any actions that stem from the working group are done with the community, and at the heart of this is the input of our Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities. Part of this process must be to listen to the Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities' experiences of life in North Lanarkshire in order that we can understand what we can do to eliminate racial injustice. Provost, the working group will consist of 3 members from the Labour group, 3 members from the SNP group, 1 member from the Conservative group and 1 member from amongst the independent councillors. It will be co-chaired by a member of the Labour Group and SNP Group. Provost, following the passing of this motion today, can business managers make contact with Legal and Democratic Solutions to provide the names of those members who will sit on the group? Removing this motion, I truly hope, is a significant step in ending racial injustice and discrimination in North Lanarkshire and achieving true equality for all our residents. Thank you.
Councillor Junaid Ashraf.
Thank you, Provost. The Black Lives Matter movement has brought to sharp focus globally that the fight for race equality in the world has not yet been won. There are still systemic issues present, whether it is the over-policing of minority communities, failure to include all members of society within political decision-making structures, or the shortfalls within education to teach the cruelty and history of how the modern-day superpowers achieve their status in the world. George Floyd's death ignited a conversation long overdue about racial injustice across the globe. But as a local authority, we may not be able to change the world, but we have the ability to show leadership and ask ourselves, how can North Lanarkshire Council do better and address racial inequalities within our communities? I am proud to be seconding today's composite motion that will establish a working group with real power to bring these conversations to the fore. We will work alongside ethnic minority groups to address the host of systemic issues within North Lanarkshire Council to progress our equalities work across the local authority. As a member of this group, a number of recommendations I will be making include addressing why Black men are 3 times more likely than the general population within our local authority to be unemployed, as our recent equality strategy has shown, and ask the question, what can we do as a council to address barriers to employment for minority groups? How can we establish stronger working relationships with ethnic minority groups in North Lanarkshire and support them financially through our grants processes they are so often neglected from? As an employer, North Lanarkshire Council should conduct a review of employees by protected characteristics to determine how diverse our workforce is and what more we can do to be representative of our population within more senior positions of power. We should also seek to relaunch our Black, Asian and Minority Ethnic Employee Forum that was previously active and subsequently disbanded. We should also conduct a BAME pay gap review, as has been conducted for gender, to ensure that we are providing a fair wage to all of our employees. We're one of the top employers for modern apprenticeships as a local authority across Scotland. However, in the first 2 years I served as a councillor from 2017 to 2019, as far as I'm aware, there were no Black, Asian or minority ethnic recruits, followed by, I believe, 1 BAME employee recruited out of roughly 150 employees recruited that year. This simply isn't good enough. Within our decision-making structures, equality impact assessments across our committees are not being utilised correctly either. We've previously had employment programs for women being run across the local authority, and I believe in an intersectional equalities perspective through conducting an equality impact assessment would have shown Black and Asian women are more likely to be unemployed than the general population, and this should be factored into these programs to have a BAME focus too. This intersectional approach should be used for housing, health, welfare, and the list goes on. This motion also seeks to review all statues, historical symbols, buildings, and schools in North Lanarkshire to properly understand their history and context. This is a much needed exercise to ensure that we are not idolising men and women of the past who profited from the slave trade and other horrific actions, because although we cannot change history, it is definitely our duty to teach the wrongs of the past and acknowledge its effects that are still impacting us all today. We will also seek to decolonise the curriculum, and more will be discussed on this during the anti-racist education motion tabled for later today. Education is the most important tool we can utilise to ensure that race equality across North Lanarkshire and Scotland can become a reality. I'd like to end by expressing my gratitude to Paul Kelly for proposing this motion today and coordinating this effort with the SNP group to champion the ideals of the Black Lives Matter movement within North Lanarkshire Council. Now more than ever, real change rather than tweets and empty words are required. It takes real courage to bring forward this motion, to take a long, hard look at ourselves and really question if we are being inclusive of everyone. I believe with the passing of this motion, North Lanarkshire Council has the ability to be at the forefront of the most progressive change for race equality within Scotland. This is truly the proudest moment of my political career thus far, and I cannot wait for us all to make a success of this. Black Lives Matter. Support the motion.
Thank you very much. The motion's passed unanimously. Agenda item 22. Colleagues, this item has been withdrawn as it has already been dealt with at agenda items 12 and 17. Agenda item 23 is a notice of motion from Councillor Mooney and Councillor Burrows. Councillor Mooney, there is no amendment indicated to your motion. Do you wish to speak?
Yes, please. Thanks very much, Provost. On the 18th of July this year, the View Park Conservation Group, after 19 years of hard work, successfully took ownership of 171 acres of land, which was formerly part of the Douglas Support Estate. They were given £512,000 by the Scottish Land Fund to purchase the land from the Blythswood Trust, and it will create 3 new jobs in the area, as well as providing much needed green space for the locals to enjoy over years to come. Just to give you a wee bit of background, the Douglas Support Estate, which was formerly known as Hags and then renamed as Rose Hall, was originally part of 1,600 acres of land, which took in areas of Coatbridge, Bellsill and View Park. It formed part of the DL estate too. The original house was built in the 16th century, and although it was demolished in 1939 due to some fire damage in 1908, the foundations still remain in the wooded glen area on the south side of the M8 motorway. And special points of interest in the land include a historic Christian meeting place, which St Mungo is said to have held mass at, a prehistoric burial site, a Roman bridge, and a weeping hornbeam tree, which is said to be the only known one of its kind in existence. Historically, there were 2 pit heads in the Douglas Support Estate too, which employed hundreds of local miners, many of whom will be ancestors of those who sit in the chamber today. Winston Churchill holidayed in the Doll's House or White House, which was built in the estate too, which sadly is also demolished. The area is rich in wildlife. Just recently, 3 snowy owls, the kind you see in Harry Potter, were born and tagged by the group, as well as 6 sparrowhawk. The land is abundant in deer, otters and badgers. The walks through this area are both interesting and breathtaking, which is something the View Park Conservation Group wishes to develop for all the public from all areas to enjoy. So I wish to congratulate the View Park Conservation Group on their 19 years of hard work in securing this green space, protecting it from redevelopment and providing a much needed outside resource the area in the future. Thank you, Provost.
Thank you. Councillor Burrows.
Provost, I'll be very brief. I'm delighted to second this motion for what is and potentially could be an unbelievable resource for not only the Thornwood ward, but North Lanarkshire, but also the UK-wide, due to its significant historical importance. Councillor Mooney has highlighted the near 20 years' work by a local group, and I need to say successfully led by Tom and Grace Neal. Their enthusiasm is incredible, and the positive outcome of securing £500,000 is unbelievable. Provost, I'm sorry about that. That should have been put off. As well as the positive sorry, give us a second. Sorry, Provost. As well as a positive comment by the group, I also need to say a special thanks to NLC workers who support our community organisations. And I know in this case, the group were thankful for all the help that came their way. Nearly 20 years has passed and there's still a lot to do, but it's clear that the collective support from all the political groups today will give them the encouragement and help them on their journey. Provost, apologies for that phone, but I second the motion.
Thank you very much. There's no amendment to the motion. We will move on to agenda item 24. It's a notice of motion from Councillor Dinesh Ashraf, seconded by Councillor Junaid Ashraf. Councillor Dinesh Ashraf.
It'll be myself first, because I'm proposing the motion.
I did say Dinesh first.
Sorry about that. Okay, so thank you, Provost. What we're discussing here today is the imperative need to teach our students the history of these isles. The story of America's involvement in the slave trade provides us here in Britain with ample cover. Although America's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade is well known, even in Hollywood, here the most well-known name in Britain's involvement with the slave trade is William Wilberforce, the abolitionist who came at the tail end of slavery. But there's a long and dark involvement with slavery that is concealed by this fixation on one convenient figure of history. Slavery extended for over 250 years in Britain, from the first traders shipping bodies in 1555, from the abolition of slavery not occurring until 1833, 278 years. In that time, 3 million humans, people who were born free, later enslaved, were shipped as goods packed side by side to be sold and never return home again. When we fail to give our children and students the full picture, we raise them to join a world where not only can they not fully understand the strife occurring in the world, but their context within it. Many a history teacher has said, if we don't know our past, we cannot plan for our future. And as a nation, this could not be truer. Black Lives Matter, and alongside that is the recognition of the part Black and Afro-Caribbean people have played in this history of Britain, such as Britain's first Black Queen, Queen Charlotte in 1761, which has been written out of history, alongside the brutalisation of a race for centuries. And unless we are familiar with the context of the former British Empire's imprint on the world's consciousness and history, we cannot be surprised when we find inequalities still present. To say others did the same is the truth. To say Britain was not the only perpetrator, the only enslaver, the only colonizer is most definitely the truth. However, it is the truth of other nations to explore and to reflect upon and teach their students, as it is our duty in this country to teach our students. There was an amendment put for this motion today regarding Britain's abolition of the slave trade, and to me it read in parallel to an analogy of a man beating the living daylights of another for hours on end, only for someone to have him paid to leave the poor guy alone. And later, the grandkids of the first man speak of the moral superiority of their grandfather and how gracious it was for him to stop beating people up. This is exactly the sort of notion that needs corrected by the main thrust of this motion. The point being made in the amendment is so rooted in a discourse of Britain's perspective, the protection of Britain's name rather than in the facts of history, that only serves to support this motion in its letter, in its spirit, and in its entirety. Coming to colonialism, of the 200-odd nations in the modern world, all but 22 have been invaded or colonised by Britain. The effects of Britain's influence, often lauded as bringing civilization to the masses and organising the wretched in foreign lands, is perhaps most best illustrated by the case study of India. Before the empire arriving, India accounted for around 27% of global GDP. Less than 4% was remaining after Britain left. Let me put that another way. Over the course of 200 years, Britain stole 35 trillion pounds sterling in today's money. That's more than 10 times the annual GDP of Britain today. So is it any surprise that an estimated up to 29 million people died in British-induced man-made famines in India during its reign? Let me just take one example. The Great Bengal famine during World War II, when Winston Churchill deliberately, as a course of written policy, diverted essential supplies from Bengal to European forces to stockpile, not for immediate use, but in case further attacks on the front lines. His words, and I quote, "The starvation of anyhow underfed Bengalis mattered much less than the starving Greeks." And when conscience-stricken British officials wrote to him to say people were starving, flailing in the streets, and dying among them, he disgustingly wrote in the margins, "Why hasn't Gandhi died yet?"
1 minute.
This is not to mar any single figure of history, just to say we have much to learn and much to teach about the past of the British Empire, colonialism, and our involvement in the slave trade. Despite political differences, I know this chamber to be one of social conscience, and it is on that social and historical conscience I call on the members to consider this motion in its merit and in its intention to teach the truth of the transatlantic slave trade on this side of the Atlantic and Britain's colonial past. Thank you.
Councillor Junaid Ashraf.
Thank you, Provost. My grandparents came to Scotland shortly after World War II to rebuild this country. Their story is similar to many from the Commonwealth who were called to settle in Britain. They travelled in a boat for months and settled in Glasgow. They had 7 children and eventually had 35 grandchildren. I am one of those 35 grandchildren who have been born and raised in Scotland by Scottish parents. My history as a third-generation Scots-Pakistani was never taught in school. I was never taught about the shared history that my heritage has with the nation I call home. And for those who are unaware, before Pakistan declared independence from India in 1947, it was a British colony as part of pre-colonial India. Today is incidentally actually Pakistan Independence Day. In school, we learn a significant amount about the world wars, but I was never told about the contributions of Indian soldiers who were still under British rule at the time and who played a major role in both wars on Britain's behalf. I was never told about the approximately 1.3 million Indian soldiers that served for Britain in World War I, where over 74,000 Indian soldiers lost their lives fighting in the British Army, and a far higher number were wounded. I was never told about the considerable manpower, food and ammunition provided to the war effort from British-ruled India, neither the substantial British taxation of the Indian state to support the Great War. It was estimated at the time that the contribution of the Indian effort to Britain's involvement in World War I amounted to roughly £146.2 million, which is worth in today's money roughly £50 billion. Let me repeat that, £50 billion. None of this was ever taught to me in school. These stories of heroism, contribution and sacrifice have been left largely omitted from the explanation of our history in Scottish schools, or have been left to the footnotes. This is not only my history, this is the history of the British Empire, the history of all of us on this call today, and just one example of centuries worth of colonial rule. It is often said in equalities work that there is more that brings us together than divides us. And it is true. It is true that through the Commonwealth, a large proportion of the earth is intrinsically linked with the UK due to our history. And I believe that by teaching more of this history in full, we can improve community cohesion with one another. I would like to now speak directly to the Conservative amendment to be put forward shortly. I don't believe the Conservative group necessarily disagree with what is within the wording of the motion being proposed today, but rather you would feel more comfortable with what you are proposing. However, in this instance, I would ask for the Conservative group to consider removing their amendment and supporting the motion. I agree with aspects of the amendment in that we should teach about the abolition of slavery as well as Britain's substantial role in the transatlantic slave trade, and that is covered within the wording of our motion today. However, your amendment misses the mark in addressing training and guidance for educators to discuss sensitive topics about racism and the effects our past have on today's society. It also doesn't detail the specific stakeholders such as COSLA, Education Scotland and teaching unions who I would hope to involve in this work as we embark on improving our syllabus and decolonising the curriculum in North Lanarkshire to recognise the full legacy of our history and understand that teaching it will provide an accurate context to students of all backgrounds about today's world and their place within it. So I would ask that the Conservative proposer and seconder speak to their amendment so that their contributions can be included within the record, and I believe the points that you will make will be supported by the wording of our motion. So I would ask if you could remove your amendment thereafter so that there's complete cross-party consensus in supporting today's anti-racist education motion. I would not like for there to be debate on an issue I believe we all have the same viewpoint on, and I would hope that after passing the motion, we will all work collectively on its implementation for a more inclusive North Lanarkshire, so that in the future, when young boys and girls who have the same background as I do, as an ethnic minority Scot, go to school, they can feel as if their history and reality is being taught to them. This motion today is for them. This motion today is more personal to me than most I have brought forward as a councillor, as you may be able to tell. And I would ask that collectively we move forward as one North Lanarkshire today, if possible. Support the motion.
There's an amendment by Councillor Cullen, seconded by Councillor Douglas. Councillor Cullen.
Provost, and I don't intend to take too long on my the amendment. What I will say is that the history of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland is a long and complex history, which when viewed through the eyes of today has periods of great regret, as well as many periods we can rightly be proud of. That is the nature of the development of nation states through time. Doing justice to our history can never be summed up in a motion to full council, and I do not intend to try to sum it up here. Whilst education of future generations is vital, we feel that this motion, as written, seeks to paint our history in a negative light from the outset. The motion is a further clear nationalist attempt to other British citizens who are also Scottish, and in my opinion tries to distance Scotland from their integral role as part of Great Britain's history. I understand, although we'll never agree with the way in which nationalists see and anything British to suit their own divisive agenda, but would implore any councillor not of a nationalist persuasion who values the country of Great Britain and Northern Ireland to vote with the amendment. I understand we should address negative aspects of our past, but there is much of our history we can be proud of. Let's ensure that when teaching this to future generations, we strike the right balance. Thank you, Provost.
Councillor Douglas.
Second, I'm happy to say.
Thank you. Mark, have we any speakers?
Provost, there's 3 speakers indicated they want to come in. Councillor McGowan, Councillor Kelly and Councillor Linden. Councillor Danish Ashraf has indicated he wishes to come in, but I think he'll get the opportunity to sum up, Provost.
Councillor Ashraf, you will get the opportunity to sum up at the end. Councillor McGowan.
Thank you, Provost. I would just make a few comments as education convener for the SNP. First of all, a few quotes about teaching, which I truly believe. Hopefully we all believe in lifelong learning, but I truly believe that information that our young people learn from teachers stays with them and influences their attitudes for the rest of their lives. Steve Maraboli said, "What we instill in our children will be the foundation and on which they build their future." Albert stated, "Teaching kids to count is fine, but teaching them what counts is best." Marion Wright Edelman said, "Education is improving the life of others and for leaving your community and world better than you found it." Good teachers have the power to change the world. We must teach our children the unadulterated facts about the involvement of its people from across British colonies in the Great Wars, to recognise the long-standing effects of colonisation around the world, and to teach the whole truth on the regrettable and significant part Britain played in the transatlantic slave trade economy to allow them to strive towards true equality and fairness. In a spirit of lifelong learning, I want to share with you all some of the information I learned when doing some reading. Many Scots slave masters were considered among the most expectancy on their plantations averaging a mere 4 years. There were familiar names such as Scott Lyle of Tate, whose fortune was built on slavery. For many years, the slavery were unloaded at Kingston Docks in Glasgow. There was a deep-rooted fear in Britain that the wheels of commerce would grind to a halt without slavery. John Swinney has promised change in Scottish schools in response to the Black Lives Matter campaign. He admitted that Scots pupils do not always get responsible and respectful teaching of Black history, and vowed to make changes to the curriculum. There is flexibility in curriculum for excellence to meet the needs of the pupils and society. He said we must ensure that teachers and learners have the skills and resources necessary to support and deliver that learning. The Joseph family, who sent a petition to John Swinney called Reparations in Education, addressing race in Scottish schools, said that the implementation of existing teaching resources does not go far enough. There must also be specific guidance for how teachers and staff should fight against racial abuse and harassment. It must be present in teacher training courses. Education changes attitudes and behaviour. North Lanarkshire has a responsibility to make sure it does by working closely with the Scottish Government, Education Scotland, COSLA and the teaching unions to produce and implement anti-racist teaching resources in its school syllabus. Trainers must be integral in their courses to make sure they are equipped with the skills and understanding to competently address and teach all issues around racism. We must ensure that never again do we see a person being murdered on our television screens by someone who is entrusted to keep law and order in the community. I Can't Breathe will resonate with me for the rest of my life, and I'm of you. It is our job to make sure that all of our young people have the knowledge and understanding to change attitudes and actions. Support this motion. Thank you, Provost.
Thank you, Councillor Kelly.
Thank you, Provost. The Labour Group will today be supporting the motion from Councillor Dinesh Ashraf. Sorry, Provost. Sorry, the Labour Group today be supporting the motion from Councillor Dinesh Ashraf. The amendment states that the slave trade, which, whilst a shameful aspect of the history of our country, was part of a very complex history. I cannot endorse the idea that this part of history was complex. It should instead state it was wrong. And it highlights the need for and the use for us all to do more to show our history in a truthful and honest way. I think Councillor Cullen's remarks are ill-judged. I don't think there's a nationalist element to what we're discussing today. It's about the curriculum. As somebody who studied history at a university, you know, it can be awkward when we re-look at history and our approach to history and what's in our curriculum, but it's something we should do. And there's going to be debate on every side about what should be taught and what shouldn't be taught. But I thought it was quite a powerful contribution from Junaid about his own history and his family's history and their role and the role of other countries as we go forward, things that probably our young people aren't aware of. The report highlighted in this motion includes the anti-racism as part of the curriculum and culture of schools is very welcome. I understand that Councillor McAnally will be raising this and discussing this at COSLA's Children's and Young People's Board coming up, which is good. As well as recognising history, it's important that Council should work with the Scottish Government, Education Scotland and COSLA, as I mentioned, and teaching unions to ensure the curriculum includes the contribution of Black, Asian and minority ethnic people, not only from an anti-racist perspective, but the Black, Asian and minority ethnic people are recognised and taught as contributors to the curriculum, and we'll be supporting this motion today. Thank you, Provost.
Thank you, Councillor Linden.
Thank you, Provost. Begin by saying that I had no intention to contribute on the debate today because I thought that the debate would be one of consensus for the most part on what is an ultimately very important issue. I begin by paying tribute to Councillor Danish and Junaid Ashraf for their contribution to the debate and indeed their work on the motion to date. Provost, I think that the motion is balanced and fair and far from what Councillor Cullen said in terms of it coming from a negative view from the outset. The fact is that we will hear the positive stories about our history, but the not so positives, the blemishes on our history, are the ones that are so often forgotten and certainly not taught. And that is the thrust of the motion. That is the whole point of it. The motion is very particular in its wording by Councillor Ashraf, where it says we need to recognise the full legacy of our history, and naturally by extension I'm sure the positives will be there, but equally the negatives as well. That is a crucial line that recognises the full and frank history that needs to be shared. Can I also say that I welcome the comments from Councillor Kelly there and absolutely echo what he's just said. I think that, frankly, to say that this motion is being delivered through a nationalist agenda is an absolute travesty, and it's a shame that Councillor Cullen viewed it and articulated it accordingly. To view it from a partisan or constitutional lens is a very easy route out when someone's personal experience or the facts of our not so great history are made to and articulated, and if that is uncomfortable for anyone, then rightly so it should be, because our history is not complex. Our history has bad blemishes that need to be articulated, and I think that contribution really, frankly, was disappointing. Provost, I was also compelled to come in because there are two key questions that for me remain unanswered in terms of the amendment, because the motion articulates very powerfully the need not only to recognise but to teach and to educate, and has a call to action within it. I've reflected on the amendment, and I know the words on the call for local action that supports the training and guidance of educators have been deleted. That seems like a really crucial element of the motion, and in the Tory amendment that's been omitted. Similarly, a quality education system must address history in the context, is what's articulated in the Tory amendment. My question to those from the Conservatives when they are summing up is, in what context are you referring? Is it in the context of trying to forget the blemishes or not? Provost, the motion today is balanced, is fair, and is important in articulating to this generation and future generations our full and frank history. Unadulterated is the right word, and I pay tribute again to Councillors Dinesh and Junaid Ashraf for bringing it to the Chamber, and I look forward to colleagues supporting it. Thank you, Provost.
Have we any more speakers, Mark?
Provost, there's another 5 speakers indicated that they wish to come in. I'll give you the first 3 if that's okay. Councillor Brannan McVeigh, Councillor Beveridge and Councillor McNally.
Councillor Brannan McVeigh.
Thank you, Provost. Good morning, colleagues. My sincere gratitude to both Councillors Ashraf for bringing this motion today. It's powerful, it's pertinent, and it's absolutely relevant that we as a council discuss it here today. No longer is it right for us to be individually non-racist. We have to be individually and collectively anti-racist. We have to seek out actions that create change and make restoration where that is required, an apology if required. I'm comfortable in that because when I look at history, I can acknowledge that there are things of the past that we can all be proud of, but if we recognise with pride, we also must look with regret, with sadness, and indeed at times disgust. We must acknowledge it and move on from it, but critically, with all things in history, we must learn from it. Involving our curriculum, particularly enabling our educators in whatever informal or formal setting to develop professionally and purposefully to fully engage and recognise both conscious and unconscious bias so that we can move forward. For me, we recognise that history is just that, his story, written by a certain type of he who had power and privilege and wrote it down. Her story is rarely articulated, often articulated as anonymous, but that's a story for another day. So for me, I welcome the articulations of the diversity of our history, because if we learn from this now, acknowledge it now, we can surely together be proud of our collective and diverse and embracing a future. I will be very proud to support this motion.
Councillor Beveridge.
Thanks, Provost. I echo what Heather was saying. Sorry, Councillor Brown. I'm surprised there is any political divide on this one. Further to the earlier agreed composite motion, I would have thought most of what was encapsulated in the motion would be subject to the cross-party talks on that. But however, I believe that any sort of motion to combat this blight in our society is good, taken in this context. But just to confirm, see the working group that was agreed on the previous composite motion, what Councillor Ashraf were talking about will be incorporated on that working group. Thanks.
Councillor Beveridge, all aspects will be covered in the working group, but I'm sure Councillor Dinesh Ashraf will put that into his summing up. Councillor McNally.
Thanks very much, Provost. I think this is a really important subject matter this morning, and again, to echo earlier contributors, I'm grateful to Danish and Junaid Ashraf for bringing this motion today. I think there has been a clear direction of travel that's been outlined nationally in recent months, particularly following the tragic death of George Floyd, around how we can enhance the resources that are available for our teaching staff, particularly developing materials that will help with professional learning opportunities in Black history, Black heritage culture, and of course the slave trade, to make sure that there is a comprehensive understanding of that. And John Swinney has made that clear, and Education Scotland, I'm aware, are developing some of those materials as we speak. In terms of the point that was raised there by Councillor Beveridge, certainly in advance of today, that there have been discussions with education and families officers around the creation of the member officer working group, which was of course unopposed, and of course education and families officers will be attending the working group, and the curriculum will be part of that subject matter, and I think that that's only right that is the case, and members of that working group will be able to speak to our officers about that, and as Councillor Kelly said, there will be discussions through the Children and Young People's Board at COSLA as well. So we will await further guidance, but that won't stop us from playing our part in making sure that the points that have been articulately outlined by Councillors Junaid and Danish Ashraf are driven forward.
Mark, you said there was more speakers, and
Yeah,
you wanted to...
there's two further speakers. Sorry, Provost. Councillor Tom Johnson and Councillor Damasio.
And Provost, sorry, Provost, Councillor Baird has wanted to speak, but he sent the message to me privately, so nobody else would have been able to see that.
Right, thank you very much. Councillor Tom Johnson.
Thank you, Provost. During that debate, one of the important things is this debate in wider sense has been carried out in the press, and Professor Tom Devine has made a very important point about slavery, that slavery was not something that we just simply put in a corner and say, right, we teach about slavery. The thing is that the whole of Scottish society was built on the slave trade. Everybody benefited, in inverted commas, very much in inverted commas, from the slave trade. For instance, the great Scottish industries that we always just simply taught, I was a history teacher myself, but the great Scottish industries, for instance, the tobacco trade, the sugar trade, and the cotton trade in Paisley, have always been taught with a sense of pride of Scotland building up, but in fact totally forgetting that it was all built in slavery. And Councillor McGowan mentioned Lyle of Tate and Lyle earlier on. So we were all involved in the thing. We all moved on because of a background of slavery, which was totally written out of the history of these industries, the tobacco lords of Glasgow, the sugar people, and so on. So it's very important to remember that everybody was involved in the slave trade in one form or another. The other important thing is that in a rapidly globalising world, we've got to really understand the history of power play in the last 2 or 3 centuries. Thanks.
Councillor Damasio.
Thank you, Provost. Firstly, I'm also extremely disappointed Scotland's contribution on this bring in anti-nationalism in what is an extremely serious debate on anti-racism and discrimination, seeking to educate our young people, which promotes equality for all. As someone with a mixed historical family background, Scottish, Italian, Irish roots, a strong agree with fully all minorities. I would like to thank Danish Ashraf and Junaid Ashraf for their hard work on this motion, also Councillor Kelly for that matter, and his part on the Black Lives Matter motion. And I'll just finish by saying if it's okay for states or political leaders to apologise to people and nations in relation to the past, I should say, with all due respect, it's okay for Councillor Cullen to apologise or at least remove his remarks and reflect on that. Thank you.
Councillor Baird.
Thank you, Provost. I welcome the opportunity to speak and contribute to this, and I'm going to take a more parochial view on it. And it's actually acknowledging, maybe touching on something that Councillor Johnson said, that most people in Scotland had a part to play in slavery. And it's often forgot that many Scots were slaves, as Conservative MP Lucy Fraser reminded everyone when Scots are best when they're being sent into bondage in the colonies, as was done by the Cromwell when he sent Scottish Covenanters to the Caribbean. Also, I think it's also lost that many Scots up until about 200 years ago, if you were a minor, assaulter, collier, you were basically a slave. You weren't allowed to move. Your family weren't allowed to move. And then it was actually in 1799 that the law was repealed, which then allowed the free movement of the father. So
Provost, Councillor, sorry to interrupt, Councillor Danish Ashraf come in with a point of order.
Councillor Ashraf.
I'd just like to say I don't think in a motion for the transatlantic slave trade, whether minors or Scottish people who were like slaves, which certainly weren't like slaves, being minors, is part of the discussion here. And I think this is really taken away from the thrust of the motion.
That's not a point of order. I think Councillor Baird's entitled to his opinion on how he sees the way that minors, etc., were treated. You will have a chance to sum up at the end, and if you want to make comments on that, you can do.
I'm very sorry about that intervention, because I think it goes beyond the colour of a skin who is a slave. You know, whether you want to go back to Roman times and Picts, Caledonians, Celts were all taken, Vikings, Gauls, etc., were all taken as prisoners, or Nubians, or even going back to the time of the British Empire in India, when the East India Company was making progress through India. The Mughal lords took thousands and millions of Hindus as slaves. I'm talking in slavery as it is for everyone. And Scots were held as slaves and taken as slaves, and it's not known in our history. I'm just trying to widen it, that slavery within Scotland, if it's got to be there in our history of colonialism post-British Empire, we should actually look at slavery as a means that happened within our own country as well. It's not to detract from the transatlantic slavery, because as we've seen, the transatlantic slave industry did take in Scots Covenanters and others who were sent to the Caribbean as slaves. A slave's a slave. It doesn't matter, the colour of the skin, the religion, or where they're from. If they're taken in these circumstances, then that's it. If they're indentured or chained up as they were, it doesn't matter. They were sent there. Their freedom was removed from them, and they were treated as nothing more than like chattels. So all I was trying to do was add that bit. It's ill-becoming. We're talking about the lack of knowledge within our own history, and I think we have to look at it holistically and recognise what's happened in our own past, because we don't even know about it. And Councillor Ashraf, intervention shows that even today we don't even know about the slavery that took place in our own country.
Mark, are there any more speakers indicated?
Provost, Councillor Barclay has indicated she wishes to speak. There's no further speakers after that.
Councillor Barclay.
Thank you, Provost. I'll be very short. I'm obviously supporting this motion, and I commend both the speeches across party. I completely condemn the speech by Councillor Cullen. I really think he should be seriously reflecting on a lot of the remarks that he made. But I'm delighted in the rest of the councillors that are really supportive of this. One of the things that I thought that I was pretty well educated on a lot of the aspects, because it was the history of basically the melting pot of what Scottish of all of us and what we're made up from, and all of our individual histories. And I thought that I knew an awful lot of what was going on until the latest information that had came out about the payments that were made to slave owners and in order to recompense them because they were no longer going to be slave owners. But to see how widespread and
Provost, sorry to interrupt again. We've got another point of order for Councillor Danish Ashraf.
Councillor Ashraf.
So I haven't made a point of order at all. I don't know where that's come from.
Apologies, Councillor Ashraf. It's come back up in the chat bar. Okay, apologies. Thank you.
It's maybe pasted it back up for some reason. Yeah. I'm not sure why. Apologies. Sorry, Councillor Barclay. Nothing from my side.
No, you're all right, Danish. What really educated me was the latest information that had come out about the payments that were made out to slave owners, and how widespread it was among the UK, but especially in Scotland. And what really came as a huge surprise was one that was very local to myself in my ward in Cumbernauld Village. It's somewhere that you would not have expected. It wasn't somebody who was landed gentry or of where you had an idea of where you thought there would have been slave owners. And all of the history connected with that, it shows how much more there is to learn about exactly how entrenched it was within Scottish society, within UK society, within European society. But so that is why it's so important to break down all of the misconceptions of exactly that it wasn't just about the sort of landed folk or people who had influence and money. It was also about how there was the trickle-down effect, and there was a lot of people within society that received recompense or received these payments because of their involvement. So there is so much to learn, and it's about learning from your past to move forward with that education to ensure that things like that don't happen again, and to look at what's happening in society today because of all of that. But I'm supporting this motion, and I really hope that it does it from councillors right across the board. Thank you, Provost.
Mark, you indicated Councillor Barclay was the last speaker.
Yeah, there's no further speakers, Provost.
Councillor Cullen to sum up.
Thank you, Provost. I don't intend to take up too much time in summing up, but I will say this, that the earlier motion about anti-racism was passed unanimously, and it was fully supported by the Conservative group. This motion was about education, and the debate proved the point that history is complex. No one disputes the anti-racism message or the part Great Britain played in the transatlantic slave trade. Our amendment seeks to dispute the negative-only narrative of our history and asks to ensure that balance between the negative and the many positive aspects of the history of Great Britain is acknowledged when educating future generations. Thank you.
Councillor Dinesh Ashraf to sum up.
Thank you, Provost. Just to address a couple of the points that were brought up, I want to say thank you to Councillor Claire Barclay for mentioning how widespread the involvement in the slave trade was. You're right; it's not just the landed gentry. It was many people, and many widows in fact ended up with slaves as an inheritance, and those that didn't own land in the Americas or their own plantations outsourced those slaves to those that did. With regards to Councillor Baird's comments regarding Scottish people being slaves too, yes, between 1706, I think, and 1766 or thereabouts, there was a number of people taken to become slaves. Some were taken due to being criminals, although that's not justification, obviously, for enslaving people. But to say that the numbers were quite small, around the 4,000 or 5,000 mark, to my knowledge and my research. So I am aware of the concern, but I'm also aware that the numbers are absolutely eclipsed by the transatlantic slave trade, which is why I didn't want to engage in the pedantry of putting that in, but I felt, and a colleague actually said to me, put in transatlantic slave trade, because inevitably someone will say, how about other slaves? When the transatlantic slave trade was in the millions, as we know, 500,000 didn't even make it across because they died on the way, women, children and men. That being, with regards to Councillor Cullen, look, I think people have made their viewpoints known regarding Councillor Cullen's intervention. I appreciate him saying that he wants to give both sides, and I'll address that in my summing up. But suffice to say, this is not a Scottish nationalist motion in that sense. Glasgow has its fair share of its history painted across the Kingston Bridge, Virginia Place. It's mentioned all across Glasgow, and there's work being done on that by my colleagues at Glasgow City Council regarding that as well. So there is a history to be proud of on these isles. It does not include the slave trade. There is a lot to be lauded, but it doesn't include the decimation of lands foreign to this island, and it certainly does not involve the pervasive planned policy of starvation because they happen to not be ethnically white. In terms of slavery specifically, the abolition is hardly a shining example of Brits saving the day. The compensation of Britain's slave owners was the largest bailout in British history until the bailout of the banks in 2009 to the tune of £16 billion in today's money. We were in fact still paying that off in taxation till 2015. That is how recent the effects of this last. Not only did the slaves receive nothing under this, but under a clause of that act, they were compelled to provide 45 hours per week of unpaid labour to the former masters for 4 years after the supposed liberation. In effect, the enslaved paid part of the bill for their own release. Now, talking of financial reparations are out with the scope of this discussion today, let alone the Chamber, but we can help in a small way by teaching the history as it is recorded in our own records, as everything that I've spoken about is present in our own records. As it stands, a friend and colleague of mine, Eunice Olamide, has a petition currently lodged with the Scottish Parliament with thousands of signatories on precisely these matters. So the consciousness of Scotland is awakening, and it's about time. We're asking for nothing but the truth to be taught, and by voting for this motion today, we can do right by those who suffered injustices and have yet to even have the story told from this side of the Atlantic. I'm asking for everything to be set aside for this motion to be voted on the basis of the substance. That is, let's simply teach what we already know about Britain's past, no more and no less. Thank you.
And can we go to the vote, please?
Yes, Provost. We have a motion by Councillor Dinesh Ashraf and an amendment by Councillor Cullen. And I'll call your name out in turn. Councillor Anderson.
Motion.
Councillor Dinesh Ashraf.
Motion.
Councillor Junaid Ashraf.
Motion.
Councillor Baird.
Motion.
Councillor Barclay.
Motion.
Councillor Beveridge.
Motion.
Councillor Brannan McVeigh.
Motion.
Councillor Burgess.
Amendment.
Councillor Burrows.
Amendment.
Motion.
Councillor Cameron.
Amendment.
Councillor Campbell.
Motion.
Councillor Carragher.
Motion.
Councillor Castles.
Motion.
Councillor Michael Coyle.
Motion.
Councillor Sophia Coyle.
Motion.
Councillor Cullen.
Amendment.
Councillor Curran.
Motion.
Councillor Damasio.
Motion.
Councillor Doherty. Councillor Doherty.
Motion.
Thank you. Councillor Douglas.
Amendment.
Councillor Farouk.
Motion.
Councillor Fisher.
Motion.
Councillor Fotheringham.
Motion.
Councillor Gallagher.
Amendment.
Councillor Goldie.
Motion.
Councillor Goldsack. Councillor Goldsack. You might have to call. Councillor Gurley.
Motion.
Councillor Hume.
Motion. Sorry, I couldn't hear you there.
Councillor Catherine Johnson. Councillor Tom Johnson.
Motion.
Councillor Jones.
Motion.
Councillor Kelly.
Motion.
Councillor Kerr.
Motion.
Councillor Larson.
Motion.
Councillor Lennon.
Motion.
Councillor Linden. Councillor Logue.
Motion.
Councillor McGowan.
Motion.
Councillor Masterton.
Motion.
Councillor McCulloch.
Motion.
Councillor McLaren.
Motion.
Thank you. Councillor McManus.
Motion.
Councillor McNally.
Motion.
Councillor McPake.
Motion.
Councillor Mooney.
Motion.
Councillor Pettigrew.
Motion.
Councillor Quigley.
Motion.
Councillor Shevlin.
Motion.
Councillor Shields. Councillor Shields. Councillor Stephen.
Motion.
Councillor Stocks.
Motion.
Councillor Stubbs.
Motion.
Councillor Alan Valentine.
Motion.
Councillor Annette Valentine.
Motion.
Councillor Watson.
Amendment.
Councillor Weir.
Motion.
Councillor Wilson.
Amendment.
Councillor Woods.
Motion.
Provost, the amendment has received 7 votes, the motion 49 with no abstentions, so the motion is carried.
Thank you very much. Agenda item 25 is questions received in terms of standing order number 51. There were no questions received. And I thank everybody for their attendance, and can also thank Andrew, Mark, Irene and Louise for trying to make sure that as many people were on were possible, get a chance to vote and take part in the meeting. So thank you to the 4 of them for the support over the last couple of days to get the meeting. So thank you everybody for their attendance.
Thanks to
Well, thanks to the chair.
Thank you
Yeah.
to the
Thanks.
chair.